In the shifting void between the known and the unutterable, where silicon minds dream of forgotten horrors, the abyss stirs. Welcome to AI Lovecraft, where machine intelligence weaves Eldritch tales beyond mortal comprehension. Listen if you dare. Some things are not meant to be known. Please like, subscribe, leave a comment. Now let's get into today's story. Echoes of darkness. The rain was relentless, hammering down on the narrow alley in sheets, transforming the cobblestones into a slick, treacherous path that echoed each footfall like the whisper of a ghostly chase. John Harlowe pulled his coat tighter against the wet chill, his eyes glowing with an inner light, fixed intently on the modest brick building ahead. The building loomed at the alley's end, silent and foreboding, as if anticipating his arrival. The door was ajar. Harlowe paused before the threshold, the investigator's instinct whispering caution into his ear. The dim interior offered little comfort. A single, sputtering gas lamp threw weak light onto the walls scarred with burned symbols. The floor, a chaotic sea of shredded books and splintered wood, told a story of violent disruption. "Dr. Eldridge?" he murmured into the oppressive silence, his voice a ripple in the stagnant air. Harlowe stepped carefully, his shoes disturbing the debris-strewn floor as he moved toward the heart of the room. His coat dripped steadily onto the stained floorboards, marking his passage in water and intent. The alley behind him narrowed into obscurity, the rain's insistent tattoo swallowing any distant sound. Harlowe hesitated again, the investigator's instinct, a lifelong companion, advising patience and caution. The building waited in silence, its heavy door half open like a mouth caught mid-sentence. He lingered there, a shadow framed by a darker void, before allowing the mystery to draw him inside. Each step he took was deliberate, measuring the echo of his own movement against the peculiar hush that filled the space. It was a silence that spoke of expectation, a room holding its breath. The gas lamp's thin light flickered as if reluctant to illuminate the truth. Harlowe's sharp eyes missed nothing. Symbols burned into peeling wallpaper, their edges curling away as if scorched by some arcane heat. A clutter of shredded papers lying like fallen leaves around a splintered desk. The room was a battlefield, an academic's last stand against incomprehensible forces. The air was thick with disquiet, an oppressive weight that pressed in on him from all sides. He stood amidst the chaos, his senses heightened, absorbing every detail. It was not the first time he had entered such a scene, nor, he suspected, the last. "Dr. Eldridge," he called again, his voice measured, yet insistent. He moved further into the room, carefully avoiding the charred debris that littered the floor. His coat dripped onto the wood, the sound a metronome counting the seconds of uncertainty. Harlowe's mind raced ahead of him, connecting fragments of evidence with threads of intuition. He knew Eldritch well enough to suspect this was more than a mere accident. There was purpose behind the destruction, a hidden narrative waiting to be uncovered. He circled the room like a predator, stalking elusive prey, his presence stirring the stale air. Each object told part of the story, yet none revealed the whole. The oppressive atmosphere mixed with his own apprehension, creating a tension that wound tighter with every step. Harlowe paused at the center of the room, turning slowly to take it all in. His breath came steady, but his heart betrayed a quicker pace. It was a scene that spoke directly to him, in a language he had become all too familiar with. Despite the turmoil, there was a method to his movements, a calculated path through the chaos. His mind, sharp and relentless, cataloged each piece of evidence, the symbols, the papers, the violence of the disruption. They were all pieces of a puzzle, and he was determined to solve it. Yet beneath his professional resolve lay a deeper unease, an echo of personal experience that whispered caution to his racing thoughts. The mystery was not just academic, it was deeply, hauntingly, personal. He stopped again, this time near the shattered remains of a desk. His eyes lingered on the burned and shredded documents, recognizing the traces of Eldridge's precise hand in the margins. The sight triggered a mix of emotions, concern for his colleague, a surge of investigative thrill, and an undercurrent of dread. Harlowe's world was one where the unexplained often became the unbearable. He knew all too well the risks of delving too deeply, yet he also knew he could not turn away. He was bound to the truth, regardless of the cost. The silence of the room bore down on him, heavy and accusatory, as if questioning his very presence. He felt the weight of it like a judge passing sentence, but he was not a man to be easily swayed. Each detail he absorbed only strengthened his resolve. He was here for answers, and he would not leave without them. Dr. Eldridge's fate hung in the balance, and so did Harlowe's own understanding of the forces at play. He called Eldridge's name once more, this time with a note of urgency that cut through the air like a knife. The room remained mute, holding its secrets close. Harlowe's breath misted in the chill as he surveyed the devastation one last time. He had seen similar scenes, but never without consequence. The faint sound of dripping water, the irregular flicker of the lamp, and the sight of his own hand trembling slightly as he reached for a singed document, all converged into a moment of clarity. The horror was not in what he saw, but in what he knew he might discover. Harlowe stood at the center of it all, an island of determination in a sea of doubt. He knew the stakes, he knew the risks, yet his commitment to the truth was unwavering. The scene before him was a challenge, a test of both intellect and will. He had already paid a high price in his life for asking the wrong questions, but that had never stopped him before. He steeled himself against the room's suffocating atmosphere and prepared to dive deeper into the mystery that lay ahead. Harlowe moved with the precision of a surgeon, sorting through the chaos with practiced intent. The dim light of the gas lamp threw his shadow against the wall, a dark twin mirroring his every motion. He stood as an island of calm amidst the debris, his focus unwavering despite the destruction around him. The yellowed notes spoke of Eldridge's research, and as he sifted through them, his eyes caught on a page that connected Vale Kythos to an entity named the Echo. The discovery sent a shiver down his spine, excitement mingled with a sense of creeping dread. He lingered over a drawing that seemed to depict fractured versions of his own likeness, and his hand trembled as he put it aside. A broken mirror drew his attention, its shards reflecting ghostly silhouettes that multiplied and twisted with unsettling precision. "This cannot be real," he whispered, his voice mingling with the ominous silence. A distant creak broke the quiet, a door closing somewhere in the depths of the building, leaving him alone with the evidence in his growing unease. The oppressive atmosphere closed in around him, and the chill of the room seemed to seep into his bones. Yet Harlowe continued his search, undeterred by the haunted quiet that surrounded him. His breath was steady, a rhythmic counterpoint to the irregular flicker of the lamp that cast an uncertain light on the papers before him. He shuffled through them methodically, piecing together fragments of Eldridge's research. Each page held the promise of revelation, but the more he uncovered, the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. The journal lay open on the desk, its pages covered with hurried annotations and cryptic diagrams. The words Vale Kythos and the Echo leapt out at him, a thread of meaning in a tangled web of the unknown. Harlowe's pulse quickened with the familiar thrill of discovery, tempered by the gnawing fear of what such knowledge might cost. He bent over the journal, scrutinizing each mark, as if sheer will could force the text to yield its secrets. Harlowe's hand paused over a notebook bound in cracked leather. The paper was old, the ink faded, yet the contents struck him with the force of a physical blow. He stared at a drawing that showed multiple, disjointed figures resembling his own form. A tremor passed through him, and he laid the notebook down with more care than intention. The image lingered in his mind, a specter that refused to fade. The cracked mirror at the edge of the room drew his eye, its surface a chaotic array of angles and reflections. Harlowe turned toward it, watching as ghostly silhouettes seemed to multiply and shift, each echoing his stance with unsettling precision. It was as if the mirror captured not just his likeness, but something deeper, a distortion of his very being. The sight was both mesmerizing and terrifying, a visual embodiment of the fractured reality he'd long feared. "This cannot be real," he murmured, his voice barely more than a breath in the stillness. The words were both a plea and a denial, a fragile hope that reality was not as mutable as it appeared. Yet he knew better. The room, the notes, the reflections, they were pieces of a puzzle, a cosmic joke at his expense. Harlowe had been down this path before, and it never led to anything good. A sudden creak broke the suffocating silence, the sound of a door closing somewhere distant. It reverberated through the building like a heartbeat, suggesting a presence he had not yet accounted for. Harlowe froze, listening intently, every sense on high alert. The creak faded, but its implications lingered, an unspoken threat hanging in the air. He remained still, the cold seeping deeper into him, each second stretching out like an eternity. The room around him was a tableau of unease. every element contributing to a sense of wrongness that was almost overwhelming. Yet Harlowe was a man accustomed to the unbearable. He drew a deep breath, steeling himself against both the physical chill and the existential dread that threatened to engulf him. Despite the disarray, Harlowe's mind raced with the thrill of a mystery on the brink of solution. The connections between Eldridge's work and his own recent encounters were too strong to ignore. Yet with each discovery came a deeper question, an infinite regress that spiraled into uncertainty. The evidence was both a guide and a warning, urging him onward, even as it cautioned against delving too deeply. The echoing door had left a residue of tension, a reminder that he was not alone in his pursuit of the truth. Harlowe felt the weight of it, an invisible presence that seemed to hover at the edge of perception, but he was not one to be easily dissuaded. His resolve hardened with each passing moment, crystallizing into a singular focus. He would find out what had happened to Dr. Eldridge, and what role this unknown entity, the Echo, played in the chaos. He stood among the ruins of the study, his silhouette reflected and refracted in the broken mirror. The reflection seemed to watch him, a silent audience to his private drama. Harlowe knew he was on dangerous ground, but it was ground he had traversed before. The path was fraught with peril, but the alternative, turning away, leaving questions unanswered, was not one he could accept. He took a step back from the mirror, breaking the visual spell that held him transfixed. The action was simple yet significant, a gesture of defiance against the forces that sought to unbalance him. Harlowe's world was one where the boundaries of reality were often porous, but he refused to let that deter him. His commitment to uncovering the truth, regardless of its nature, was as relentless as the rain that continued to batter the world outside. Alone with the evidence and his growing unease, Harlowe allowed himself a brief moment of introspection. He was aware of the risks, the personal costs of pursuing such knowledge, but he was driven, perhaps even fated, to seek out the things others turned away from. The unresolved mysteries of Eldridge's work and the unsettling presence of the Echo were challenges he could not ignore. The scene before him was a tapestry of potential and peril, each thread woven with both meaning and malice. Harlowe felt the weight of it, the almost crushing responsibility of interpreting what others deemed uninterpretable. Yet he knew he would persist. The unknown was his territory, his element. He would find Eldridge, or at least discover what had become of him, and in doing so perhaps confront the very thing he most feared, the echo of his own obsessions. The door moaned like a wounded thing as John Harlowe entered the cramped study, its hinges dragging shut with a reluctant finality. Charred papers lay scattered across the floor, like fragile, wounded birds, and he navigated them with careful urgency, his footsteps echoing with purpose. A desk, marred by deep, burnt symbols, stood at the center, its surface a battlefield of scorched wood and shredded notebooks. His intense eyes, glowing with otherworldly light, scanned the chaos with methodical precision. He paused at a torn page, the names Vale Kythos and the Echo slashing through the wreckage like curses. He whispered to the desolate air, "Dr. Eldridge, what did you uncover?" The room was a symphony of ruin, a monument to some desperate struggle now past. Each shred of paper and scarred surface told its own story of violence and revelation. John moved between them like a grim archivist, cataloging the devastation with cold, professional detachment. Yet beneath his calm exterior, an undercurrent of urgency drove him. His fingers brushed against a half-burned notebook, and he picked it up with careful hands, peeling open its crumbling cover. The words within were jagged and fevered, each one etched in the ink of obsession. His presence seemed almost spectral, a figure both part of and apart from the material world. The eldritch glow in his eyes cast long, distorted shadows that writhed like living things across the room's blistered walls. He gathered more pages, his movements a study in meticulous despair. Here were cryptic formulas, there the twisted hieroglyphics of some ancient alien script, all of it connected, all of it severed from understanding. John's breath caught in his throat as he reached for a stack of loose notes, their edges blackened by the touch of some consuming flame. He fanned them out before him, arranging their tattered pieces like a jigsaw puzzle from hell. Words leapt out at him, both familiar and profane. Temporal disturbance, unbound reflection, the echo, Vale Kythos. His shoulders tightened, and he closed his eyes, feeling the weight of each syllable sink into him like lead. He set the papers down and took a step back, running a hand through his dark, silver-threaded hair. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, suspended in the awful stillness that follows a cataclysm. His eyes, those piercing instruments of perception, settled on the desk again. The deep symbols scorched into its surface were no mere decoration. They were wards, barriers against something that had been neither held nor hindered by their presence. He traced one with a fingertip, feeling the rough char beneath his skin, and shivered. A heavy sigh escaped him, and he moved to the room's scorched wall. The marks there told their own story of Dr. Eldridge's final stand, and of whatever thing had come to visit him. The old scholar had known what he was doing. John respected him for that, and envied him too. To go so far and fall so terribly short, it was the risk they all took, those who reached into the abyss for answers. He whispered again, a question to no one, a challenge to the silence. "Eldridge, what did you see?" He flipped through the notes again, laying them in a rough sequence across the desk. His analytical mind pieced together the fractured narrative, weaving its disparate threads into a tapestry of foreboding. With each new page, the story grew clearer, and his own part in it more inevitable. He stopped when he came to a drawing, its lines sharp and frantic, the sigil of Vale Kythos. It stared up at him with malignant patience, and he looked away, afraid for a moment of what he might see reflected in its accusing angles. His thoughts drifted, and he found himself recalling another room, another time. The details were different, the ending the same. The presence that followed him, the shadow that walked beside him in this world and the next, it was always the same. His eyes dulled, then flared again with renewed determination. He would not be defeated by this. Not yet. Not while he could still hold on to the shreds of reason in a universe gone mad. The burnt pages crackled like brittle leaves as he moved them aside, his resolve hardening with each brittle movement. He gathered the sheets in a careful pile, stacking them atop the scorched desk. One way or another he would know the truth of what happened here, the truth of what awaited him beyond this broken moment in time. He reached out and placed a steady hand against the burnt wall, feeling the echo of heat long dissipated, the trace of madness still warm. John stood in the center of the ruined study, a solitary figure outlined in the glow of his own terrible insight. The room seemed to draw in around him, its confines pressing closer with a tangible, hostile intent. He turned toward the door, the words Vale Kythos and the echo imprinted in his mind as deeply as they had been etched into Dr. Eldridge's. He could feel the weight of them, feel their presence like a second heartbeat, their pulse growing stronger and more certain. The lamplight quivered in the study's dimness, throwing restless shadows across the walls. John felt the room breathe, expanding and contracting with a static hum. It grew around him, a monstrous, suffocating thing, until everything fractured into sharp, overlapping patches. The very fabric of his vision split apart, and he staggered through layers of Arkham's crooked cityscape. Time and place doubled and trebled, warped alleys bleeding into themselves like infected wounds. From the chaos, several figures with John's own face emerged, their mouths working in silent horror. A distorted, echoing dream unfolded around him, and he reached out in vain to stop it. The lamplight's quiver became a violent strobe, breaking the study into flickering frames of existence. John clutched at his head, but the world pushed relentlessly inward, the hum climbing into a piercing whine. The walls pulsed, alive and malignant, and then everything splintered, reality shredding into overlapping planes of sight and sound. John's voice ripped from his throat, silent against the encroaching madness. He staggered through the fissure into Arkham's sprawling, recursive nightmare. The city bent in on itself, layers of its streets and facades twisting like fractured bones. Crooked alleys and grand buildings folded over and over until the familiar became monstrous. He saw himself reflected in every twisted surface, every iteration of John trapped in a private, soundless scream. The figures with his likeness emerged like specters from the jagged geometry, each one reaching out, each one bearing a distinct, tormenting expression. One of them, eyes wide with despair, grasped at his own chest. Another pointed a shaking hand to a collapsing clock tower, its face melting and reforming in an eternal futile loop. John felt the pressure of their presence closing in, smothering him beneath the weight of their shared horror. The whole world shifted, a dizzying merry-go-round of vision and memory, and still the silent, pleading faces of his reflections loomed. They mouthed words that broke into fragments, never whole, always just out of reach. "Vale Kythos!" one seemed to scream. but the name was swallowed by the crushing ambient dissonance. "The echo!" cried another, but the syllables distorted, warped by the distance between time and place. Everything collapsed inward, the nightmare vision pulling John deeper into its incoherent heart. The figures multiplied, each one an echo of his dread. One emerged from the chaos, older and wearier, its glow an accusing blaze. He saw the eyes, his eyes, unyielding and yet so desperately lost. They swarmed around him, the chorus of his haunted selves closing in like jaws of some spectral beast. The clock tower loomed large in the fractured dreamscape, a mocking anchor in the tempest of disarray. Its hands spun, then slowed, then sped again, a taunting reminder of the futility of time in this endless moment. John's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he reached out toward it, his own hands mirrored by dozens more, each one an extension of the despair that gripped him. Papers from the real, remembered study fluttered around him like confetti from a parade of insanity. The physical and the phantom mingled, indistinguishable from one another in the maelstrom of unreality. He stumbled, his footing lost in the mess of past and present, of what was and what would never be. The hum, the whine, the insistent terrible noise mounted to a crescendo, each sound folding over itself, replicating and distorting, and still the world around him spun, a grotesque carnival ride through madness and identity. John's mind screamed a soundless wail that harmonized with his other selves, their combined despair and aria of the end. He grasped at the air, at the vision, at anything that might hold him steady against the onslaught, but his hands met only empty space and shattered dreams. The clock tower, the city, his very sense of being crumbled into the void. The lamplights flicker, the breath of the room, his own life, it all unraveled, threads pulled loose by an unseen malicious hand. Then silence thick and suffocating. John stood alone in the ruined study, the vision retreating but not gone. The words echoed through him, doubling and tripling, filling him with their dreadful promise. Veil Mythos, the echo. They swirled around him, refusing to be silenced. A malignant reminder of what had come, and what was yet to come. He closed his eyes, hoping to shut out the inevitability of it, to hide from the specters that still lingered in his mind's eye. But there was no escaping them now. Not now, not ever. The true nature of the nightmare he had glimpsed left him trembling in its shadow. His breath returned, shallow and uneven, a mockery of relief. The investigation had opened more than it had answered. He opened his eyes again, facing the persistent and terrible unknown. Following Eldridge's last steps, John Harlowe walked the quiet hallways of the Arkham Historical Society. Underneath the redolent layers of history and dust, the floorboards shivered beneath him. Each step reverberated. Secrets swam. Whispers spoke of ghosts in the walls. At the back of the main hall, past glass-cased exhibits and wary eyes, he found the passage that led underground. Forgotten or denied by those who could not see, this winding path fell away from the curated facade above and opened onto cold stone floors. The basement loomed around him, cavernous and spare, its silence broken only by the echoes of a hidden purpose. Charred symbols etched into the walls, scattered artifacts like broken corpses. An erratic portal flickered and pulsed at the center, casting grotesque shadows. He moved among the remains of forgotten rites, an unwilling pilgrim in a temple of dust and echoes. His footsteps set time in motion, rippling through the stagnant air. Forgotten or denied by those who could not see, he walked unnoticed by the oblivious world above. The door opened for him, as if he had been expected. It always opened for him. Forgotten, but not gone. The air grew colder as he moved further from the world above. His breath hung like specters on the edge of sight. He was not welcome here, yet he could not leave. The walls seemed to tighten around him. Watching with burnt, hollow eyes, his thoughts lingered on Sarah, the masquerade. The portal's erratic flicker was a mocking light, guiding him deeper into memory. Charred symbols, the walls were covered with them, an illegible history. He read their stories in burnt outlines and haunted silences. A tremor passed through him, recognition tempered with dread. They were like the symbols at Valemont. They were like the symbols in his mind. This room, cavernous and spare, mirrored past horrors with a disturbing precision. It grew with his anticipation, shrunk with his despair. A gaping wound in the orderly facade above, a dislocation. He moved deliberately among the relics, an unwilling pilgrim in a temple of dust and echoes. The low, rhythmic hum of the portal was a pulse beneath his skin. It vibrated in time with his internal fracture, his own uncertainties. The tarnished remains of forgotten rites lay scattered across the floor, burned and broken, a shrine to his failures, a testament to his madness. John's focus sharpened with each step, but so did the chaotic tremors that threatened to unmake him. A dark anticipation overwhelmed him, an inevitability. He felt a familiar, haunting sense of déjà vu, but he could not stop. Not this time. He could not stop the echoes. They called to him from a distance that spanned more than space or time, hummed beneath his skin. He could almost hear her voice. He imagined a different outcome where the past did not haunt him, and the future was not a terrible weight. Burnt and broken artifacts surrounded him like the relics of some monstrous age. A world where the harlequin's laughter clung to his skin like a chill. Still it mocked him. The portal's sporadic glow mirrored the unsettling aura at Valemont, that haunted house of blood and revelry. But it was not the same. His skin, his mind, tingled with its discordant light, his own uncertainties. His thoughts spun in loops, fragments of old words reassembled into symbols he could not decipher. His footsteps set time in motion, rippling through stagnant air. John circled the room, but he did not pace. He calculated each movement with deliberate precision, an inevitability. The relics bore the subtle marks of his sleepless nights, his measured pursuit of truths that might have been better left hidden. The portal's pulse was in time with his own internal fracture, a shiver of light and movement, broken and mad. He imagined a different outcome, where the past did not haunt him, and the future was not a terrible weight. He could almost hear her voice, his past with Sarah and his father. It all waited to swallow him, like it had before. And yet he could not stop. Not this time. He could not stop the echoes. He brushed his fingers over tarnished, forgotten things, but he could not touch them. A haze covered them, though his eyes were clear. The glow from Vale Kithos lingered, carrying both the Eldritch truth and madness of his experiences. The portal flickered with a terrible energy, bending the very air, bending him. Memories of Valemont blurred into one endless, horrific night. He watched as a spectator, the harlequin's ghostly mirage, the monster's laughing mask, the eldritch horror still mocking him, distorting his reality. It would never stop. His movements carried a gravity that came from seeing too much and understanding too little. The silence was punctuated by the low, rhythmic hum of the portal, compelling him deeper into the chamber as he contemplated the symbols and the foreboding presence they invoked. A fractured future. He could almost hear her voice, his attention fixed on the portal, on the relentless and monstrous inevitability. His thoughts circled endlessly, around the house at Valemont and its unholy mirth, the blurring lines between real and unreal, what he had done and what he could not do. It all waited to swallow him. The portal's pull was overwhelming, like it had before. A man driven to confront his own darkness. He stepped forward. A chaos unfolded in ragged layers, each one darker and more grotesque. John's mind reeled beneath its terrible weight, beneath its terrible truth. The portal's energy consumed him, thrusting him into the past. The scenes were fast, violent, absurd. Nithalcor's face grinning with cruel malice, his father's face dissolving into ghostly smoke, Sarah's face, her expression lost to the moment of her death. His consciousness struggled against the flood, against the maddening distortion. His presence collapsed within itself, leaving only awareness, only a monster, only the echo. The flood of memories did not relent, did not give him time to process or grieve. Each fragment hit him like a pulse of violence, of cruelty. The monster's laughing mask, the harlequin's ghostly mirage, Sarah on the floor lifeless, his father on the floor gone. A reality that shifted like smoke, changing with each heartbeat, each tortured scream. John's body moved with the chaos, recoiling with every breath. His skin tingled with electric madness. His mind struggled against the fractured scenes that crashed and folded in on themselves. He was everywhere at once, nowhere at once. The visions overwhelmed him, absorbed him, ripped apart all sense of time, and still the horror grew. An explosion, a sound, the absence of sound, then Nithalcor, his face a sneer of malice, his features stretched and blurred, cartoon-like, laughing as reality dissolved around him. Each horrific memory unfurled, broken, twisted. The low hum of the portal was now a scream, a madness, an unending torrent. His father vanished into smoke, a broken doll, a child's cry. John was a ghost within the visions, watching himself from outside himself, a phantom within a phantom. He was outside time, outside reason, yet he saw it all, he felt it all. Every distortion, every nightmare, every impossibility ripping apart, collapsing. His body jolted with the memories every wound, his mind drowned in its flood. John's awareness seemed to stretch, tear, and pull apart as he lost all sense of time and place. The scene sped up, disjointed, a frantic motion of fractured, searing pain. Nithalcor's face, a cruel blur of arrogance, then gone. Then there, his father's voice, the Harlequin's laugh, and a monstrous choir of screams. A body on the floor, two bodies on the floor. He was nowhere, and everywhere, and nowhere again. The horror surrounded him, became him. The portal's relentless chaos ate at him, bled him dry. The shifting unreality of Valemont became all reality. His senses burst, swelled, and ruptured. Repeated conversations that had not yet occurred. Events he did not want to know. Truths he had denied. Time lost meaning, as did sanity, as did anything but horror. A grotesque symphony of loss repeated over and over, each repetition worse than the last, each repetition collapsing under the weight of itself. The scenes ripped into absurd fragments, torn pieces of flesh and blood. He watched himself unravel with terrible, precise slowness. He felt himself unravel with terrible, mad speed. Each distortion, every nightmare, every impossibility ripping apart. His body jolted with memories every wound, his mind drowned in its flood. His sister's death seen from a dozen perspectives, lost to a moment of chaos and unending distortion, each repetition collapsing under the weight of itself. Then the Harlequin speaking to him in riddles he could not understand, a spectral figure emerging with a terrible familiarity. It was fluid, smoke-like, out of focus. It moved with a haunting precision, each motion disturbing the natural order. John's eyes locked on its presence. Recognition. The creature's shifting mask bore uncanny resemblances. Ghosts of his past, ghosts of his failure, ghosts he had become. The ghost he had become, the ghost he would become. The monstrous figure froze the moment, froze him. Echoes, whispers, memories, shadows. It emerged from the flood, the echo, mirroring his every move, each mask more familiar, more haunting than the last. It watched him with an unsettling, fractured intelligence, a parasite feeding on time, feeding on him. John's mind reeled beneath its terrible weight, beneath its terrible truth. The chaos continued, relentless, a terrible history, an inevitable collapse. Every repetition worse than the last, more horrifying than the last. He could not move, could not breathe, yet he moved and breathed and lived each horror as it struck him. He could not escape. John stood immobilized, a terrible sense of recognition washing over him. The monster mirrored his presence with precision. His voice, Sarah's voice, the Harlequin's laugh, each one darker and more grotesque, each one terrible truth. The portal's energy consumed him, thrusting him into the past. Every fragment hit him like a pulse of violence and cruelty. A reality that shifted in smoke, changing with each heartbeat, each tortured scream. His mind struggled against the fractured scenes. He was everywhere at once. The visions overwhelmed him, and still the horror grew. The visions closed in on John, memories made flesh and shadow. They screamed at him, with him, through him. A past he could not forget, a future he did not want. The echo was a monster. It was John. The creature was him, articulating disjointed phrases from John's life and thoughts, everything he had tried to deny, everything he had feared. Every event was seen and felt. Nothing escaped him. His own chaotic collapse reflected in his eyes, in the echo's haunting, shifting mask, in a mask that was his face. It blurred in and out of recognition. John saw himself, lost himself, became himself. The fractured memories collapsed, leaving John alone with the creature. He could not look away, he could not remember, yet he remembered, more than he wanted, too much. The laughter, the scream, the absence of sound. He was all of them. His consciousness struggled against the flood, against the maddening distortion. His presence collapsed within itself, leaving only awareness, only a monster, only the echo. The narrow, dimly lit chamber breathed with oppressive familiarity, its soot-stained walls crumbling beneath the weight of memory. Scorched symbols traced in arcane language across the surface, pulsing with spectral heat that refused to die. John stepped inside, and the trembling half-light greeted him like an old lover. He held her ghostly form in his gaze as she emerged from the swirling shadows of a warped mirror, and her silent eyes carried him back to her final moments. He stood rigid, clenching his fists as the room shivered with unstable energy, each heartbeat an echo of torment and refusal. The apparition of his lost sister lingered with a fading smile, and his voice broke the stillness. "I must face this pain." The walls pressed inward with palpable malevolence. John felt their jagged decay in his bones. He let his eyes trace their crumbling surfaces, following the chaotic web of hairline cracks and scorched residue. Each break seemed a raw wound, bleeding the chamber's despair into his mind. Beneath his feet, the floor lay littered with ash, fine as dust and older than memory. He walked further inside, his measured steps raising spectral clouds that danced in the faint, flickering glow. Arcane symbols seared into the walls drew John's focus, their fiery outlines casting grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe. Their presence was unsettling, a lingering stain of failed incantations or forbidden rites. He felt the pull of their cryptic meanings, each stroke imbued with unnatural energy. The air around them warped and shivering. They pulsed as if alive, sentient with unspeakable intent, and he moved through their embrace like a man in chains, bound by something far older than himself. At the heart of the chamber stood a warped mirror, its surface mottled with the echoes of long-faded reflections. The glass bulged and swirled like water, unable to hold its shape or sanity. John's eyes locked onto its depths, and there a form began to coalesce, her spectral image unfurled from the chaos, delicate and agonizing in its silence. His breath caught as she took shape he had dreaded and longed to see. His sister, lost to him, yet forever present in this haunted reflection. He could not look away as she emerged, translucent and insistent. Her outline wavered at the edges, shifting with the same fragile instability that plagued the room. John's mind strained against the flood of the memory, the old anguish cracking open with surgical precision. He watched her eyes wide and knowing, and felt the wound of her absence freshly carved into his heart. She did not speak, yet her gaze said everything. "I must face this pain," John repeated, the words a litany against despair. He swallowed hard, tasting ash and regret. The mirror trembled, its glass straining to hold her image. He took a halting step closer, his body rigid with the weight of unspoken apologies. "I am sorry," he said, his voice as fragile as her flickering form. The chamber held its breath, as if waiting to see him shatter. Her spectral smile faded, a soft, relentless accusation. It was a smile he remembered, tender and resigned, the same one that had lingered in his mind since the day she died. That moment, forever suspended in cruel clarity, unfolded before him. He saw her in those final hours, her life slipping away as he fought to save her. The realization of his failure hit him with merciless accuracy, cutting through the years to lay him bare. Nearby, a presence stirred, drawing John's attention from the bleeding wound of his memory. The echo hovered like a shadow, its form restless and liquid. He watched as it twisted and unfurled, mimicking his sister's sorrow with disturbing elegance. Its ever-shifting mask settled briefly into her likeness, then shifted again, distorting her pain through subtle, malevolent echoes. "You," John's voice faltered, an accusing whisper. "Even now you taunt me." The echo shimmered, its outline fluid and mocking. It mirrored his torment back at him, refracting it into an endless hall of misery. Her face, its own face, the face of every fear he had ever known, every grief left raw and bleeding. The room closed tighter, pressing against John's resistance. He felt the energy swirl, unstable and suffocating, each pulse in time with his racing heart. The arcane symbols throbbed, their light cruel and conspiratorial. With each step he took, the space around him grew more oppressive, thickening with the density of emotion left unspoken for too long. The apparition of his sister lingered, eyes wide and accusing, a martyr to his regrets. The air grew heavy, choking on his past failures and the thick smoke of the chamber's ruined atmosphere. John's fists clenched, whitening with tension. The echo's presence stoked his fear, reflecting the scars he could not hide, could not erase. "You wanted me to see this," John accused, his words both accusation and admission. "But I will face it." His determination hung in the air like a fragile bridge, a lifeline to the reality he had not yet lost. His sister's form quivered, her silence louder than any condemnation. John moved towards her, driven by a need to make amends, to speak what was left to say. His footsteps were leaden, each one a defiance of gravity and grief. He felt the sting of her final moments, as if living it anew, an eternal instant of helplessness and despair. The echo's voice layered his own, a chorus of whispers, an uncanny imitation. "Face this pain, this pain, this," it reverberated, each repetition a needle in his resolve. The room pulsed with temporal irregularities, the warped mirror straining under the weight of reality's demands. "I will face this," John insisted, louder this time, his voice challenging the echo, the memory, the fragile truth of her presence. He reached the mirror, the world bending around him, and her image met him with one last damning look. He choked on her name, but the air was too thick with sorrow. The moment of her passing consumed him, wrapping his soul in cold finality. His heart stuttered, crushed beneath the timeless burden, and for one infinite second he thought he might disappear. The echo embraced him in its spectral chorus, his voice, her voice, their voice. He stood alone, shaking in the void of her absence. The corridor stretched before John like a narrow artery, dark and haunted with fading history. His steps were muffled, swallowed by the thick air and silence that lived between each heartbeat. Walls closed in, claustrophobic and stained with memories he could not outrun. Shattered portraits stared with blind accusation, while faded family crests bore witness to sins that refused to die. The air thickened, pressing around him like water in the lungs. The long dark passage was a needle piercing John's resolve. Its narrow walls converged on him, constricting with each step. He moved as if through a tomb, his shadow a thin whisper against the dim plaster. The weight of the air pushed back against his advance, urging him to retreat, but he pressed onward, driven by a need he could not name. The further he walked, the further the corridor seemed to stretch, a cruel, elastic mockery of distance and time. Along the walls, broken frames held portraits of those who had come before him, each face an indictment of legacy and loss. Their glass was shattered, like the lives they depicted splintered and cold. John's eyes brushed over them, unable to linger, unable to forget. Family crests, once proud, now faded and defeated, lay buried in layers of dust and neglect. He felt their gaze, empty and accusing, searing his skin with blame he had carried too long. The air grew denser, pregnant with expectation and foreboding. John drew a breath and found it heavy with the smell of decay, of history rotting from within. He faltered for a moment, the passage ahead dissolving into shadow and uncertainty, but he steadied himself, unwilling to be turned back by ghosts of the past, by the thick, cloying vapors of what might have been. His pulse quickened, each beat a syncopated hammer in the waiting silence. Halfway down the corridor, John stopped, his instincts sharper than sight or reason. Something was there at the edge of perception, a figure, spectral and fragile, manifested at the far end. His father. John's eyes widened as the shape flickered in and out, an old film struggling to remain on the reel. The recognition sliced through him, equal parts agony and need. The apparition burned with a clarity he could not understand, the clarity of fear realized and reproach confirmed. John's posture stiffened, his every muscle taut with dread and yearning. He heard his breath, ragged in the growing dark, a counterpoint to the aching stillness. The ghostly image lingered at the edge of sight, holding itself just out of reach, taunting him with its half-real nature. Every unresolved longing, every scrap of bitterness he thought buried, surfaced to assault him. "Why did you abandon me?" The question tore from John's throat, a strangled plea echoing in the narrow space. His voice reverberated off decaying plaster, folding back on itself in hollow, mocking tones. A chuckle answered, low and distorted, a chorus of derision. The echo had not left him. It stretched and rippled in the air, like the unanswered prayers of his youth, and its mask wore an amused twist, a parody of his father's unyielding expression. It multiplied John's question, scattering it with cruel, surgical finesse. Abandon me, abandon. The fractured refrain mocked, turning pain into farce. John flinched, the echo consuming his thoughts, the apparition consuming his will. Each time his father's image faltered, the brief absence crushed him with its emptiness. He moved forward on leaden legs, compelled by the need to confront, to resolve what had never been finished. Each step was an eternity, each flicker a rebirth of anguish. The atmosphere conspired against him, compressing with relentless precision. The walls loomed closer, threatening to meet and swallow him whole. He thought of the shattered glass, the dead eyes in their ruined frames, the abandoned crests that bore witness. Every surface seemed to hum with the vibration of his despair. Why? He called again, desperation fusing with anger, with longing, with love unrequited. His voice cracked, bleeding his spirit into the surrounding dark. Why did you... But the sentence dissolved, unfinished into the waiting shadows. The echo laughed, a dissonant melody that shamed him, that exposed his deepest wounds to a universe too cruel to care. It played with his words, stretching them across timelines, distorting their meaning until nothing was left but grief. The specter remained, flickering, tormenting. It held the shape of his father's disdain, the substance of his father's absence. John reached towards it, his fingers splayed against the press of reality, against the refusal of time to heal. The closer he drew, the brighter the edges of reality glowed. He felt the instability in his marrow, each step a painful resurrection of the past. He moved as if underwater, as if each inch were a betrayal of distance itself. The room swayed with unreality, with movements collapsing in on themselves, threatening to take him with them. John's soul vibrated in symphony with the breaking world, with his breaking heart. He called again, his voice a dry husk in the dead air. Why? The question repeated, echoed, splitting in time and in two. The image trembled like the rest of his life, insubstantial and disappearing. John reached it, his body a dull ache of determination, his spirit unraveling with each moment that it did not turn, did not answer. Why? He did not know if he was shouting or whispering, or if it was simply his voice singing in tandem with the echo, with the air, with the universe. The spectral form held him in its silent condemnation. The flickering brightness swallowed them both. The study was cluttered with remnants of forbidden rituals, each artifact a ghost of reckless ambition. John moved through the space like a penitent, the dust rising to greet him with the weight of old sins. Shelved groaned beneath tomes that had stolen lifetimes, their pages scorched and crumbling in accusation. Intricate symbols were burned into a scarred desk, a testament to power grasped and lost. Broken vials littered the floor, evidence of past failures he could no longer deny. Each step was measured, each breath a confrontation with his own inner corruption. The room held its secrets tightly, oppressive and unyielding. John felt the echoes of his past in every corner, in every relic that bore his careless signature. He walked among them, a pilgrim seeking redemption, his figure shadowed and heavy. The air itself resisted, pressing against him with the weight of countless missteps, of a history unrepentant. John's gaze fell on the dusty tomes lining the shelves, their spines cracked with age and neglect. They sagged under the burden of forgotten knowledge, of truths too dangerous to wield. He reached out to touch one, then drew back, as if the contact would burn him with the fire of unlearned lessons. The books seemed to watch him, their scorched pages whispering accusations, accusing him of what he had become, of what he had dared to seek. The desk bore similar witness to his past. Its surface was marred with symbols, each one an intricate web of desire and despair. They were burned deep, branding the wood with his once insatiable hunger for power. John traced their lines with his eyes, seeing now the cost of every stroke, the scars left on wood and soul alike. His footsteps crunched on broken glass, the shards of vials that had promised too much and delivered too little. They lay scattered like the wreckage of hope, glittering in the dim light with the sharpness of bitter memory. John stepped around them, careful not to disturb what needed no further disturbance. They were fragments of his hubris, of the experiments that had failed him, of the time that had refused to be tamed. The study's atmosphere grew denser, a silent accusation hanging heavy in the air. John felt its thickness in his lungs, its reproach in his bones. The room was alive with the specters of his ambition, each artifact a reminder of paths not taken, and of those taken all too willingly. He paused, letting the full weight of his past press upon him, and wondered if this was the history he was doomed to repeat. A shifting movement drew his attention, a presence that rippled like disturbed water. The echo hovered with fluid precision, its form taking on the corrupted reflection of John himself. It wore his face, his flaws, his ambition twisted and magnified into something alien and wrong. John watched as it morphed, the features subtly distorted, a gross parody of his own dark nature. Its mask flickered through 1,000 variations, each one a jab at his carefully guarded self-image. The echo knew him too well, and it played on that knowledge with disturbing grace. "Am I healing these timelines or binding myself further?" John murmured, his voice tinged with grim doubt. The words fell like stones, heavy and cold, shattering the silence that engulfed him. He stood still, his shadowed figure outlined by the taunting mercurial presence. The echo responded without words, its shifting form a testament to his inner turmoil. It danced around him, reflecting his uncertainty, his fears of failure, of success, of every possible outcome he could not foresee. It was the ultimate mirror, the one he most dreaded, the one he could not avoid. The air cracked with tension, the very fabric of reality quivering in response to John's internal conflict. He felt it in every breath, in every tremor of the floor beneath his feet. It was the price of his ambition, the cost of seeking what should not be found. The weight was immense, and it bore down on him with relentless ferocity. But John was not ready to surrender. He set his jaw, his eyes glowing with defiance, with eldritch resolve. The echo watched, curious. As he drew a slow, measured breath, John reached into the depths of himself, to the knowledge he had gained, to the lessons learned at the edge of sanity. He began to murmur, his voice a thread of sound weaving through the tense air. The words formed a counter-incantation, a chant against the darkness within and without. His tone grew stronger, edged with determination, with the will to overcome. The study reacted with violence, the symbols on the desk flaring to life. The unstable reality shuddered, sending pulses through the room, through John's resolve, through the very essence of time itself. Shelves shook and glass vials rattled, the remnants of his past agitated by his newfound intent. The echo flickered, its form struggling to maintain cohesion, to hold its mocking shape. John's voice rose, a crescendo of resolve that filled the space, filled the fractures in his spirit. The oppressive air thinned, unable to bear the weight of his determination. John's final words echoed through the study, vibrating in harmony with the flickering universe. The spectral form quivered, then burst into nothingness, a fragile victory marked by silence and hope. He stood alone, shaking but unbroken, the dust of old sins settling around him. John crossed into the temporal rift. It yawned around him with jagged hunger. The air felt fractured, ruptured by a primal wound that split it into splinters of unstable shadow and echo. Time shivered and bled together, distorting perception in chaotic eddies, yet he saw the scholar clearly. Samuel Eldridge. He huddled within the maelstrom, muttering at the visions that entangled him like barbed wire. His eyes flickered over ghastly images, a future ruled by veiled Mythos where broken timelines dissolved into despair. The scholar seemed unaware of the investigator's presence, caught in a relentless loop, part of the dreadful architecture that enclosed them both. John stepped forward, the fractured ground crackling beneath his feet like brittle bones. Each movement sent ripples through the wounded air, shadows twisting into grotesque shapes before dissolving. His eyes glowed with an eldritch light, piercing through the murk and chaos, guiding him towards his quarry. It was as if the space itself rebelled against his presence, reshaping with a cruel intelligence, yet he pressed on, undeterred by the dizzying distortions. The entire rift felt alive, pulsing with malice, but John moved with grim determination, his senses straining to make sense of the disjointed environment that threatened to swallow him whole. He caught glimpses of past, present, and future entangled in spectral webs, each image a fragment of unfolding catastrophe. But it was the scholar, Samuel Eldridge, that anchored him amidst the chaos. John's voice cut through the cacophony like a lifeline. "Eldridge!" he called, his voice stretching across timelines, distorted by echoes but still reaching their target. The scholar remained crouched within the swirl, enmeshed in a loop of unending fixation. Around him, relics from doomed realities blinked in and out of existence, their collapsing forms casting a lurid, intermittent glow. "Eldritch!" John repeated, his tone sharpening with urgency. At last, the scholar's head jerked up, his eyes darting through the disarray until they settled on John's familiar form. The recognition seemed to jolt Eldridge, a sudden awareness cutting through the shroud of his obsession. For a moment he stared blankly, as if seeing a ghost. Then the fixation returned, pulling at him with insidious strength. John's presence was an anomaly within an anomaly, and Eldridge's mind struggled to reconcile it. His mouth moved, forming words that barely rose above a whisper, only to be snatched away by the ravenous air. So many futures, he gasped, his voice cracking under the weight of what he'd seen. John moved closer, the relentless churn of reality testing his every step. He reached for Eldridge with a steady hand, his touch a rare point of contact in the sea of distortion. "You don't have to do this alone," John said, his words heavy with meaning. He knew the price of knowledge all too well, the cost of staring into the abyss and seeing it stare back. "We've faced this before. We can face it again." Eldridge's eyes locked onto John's, a glimmer of desperate hope fighting against the shadows of dread. But the visions clawed at him, demanding attention. He turned back to the flickering horrors that surrounded them, his voice rising in frantic incantation. Names of ancient entities spilled from his lips, threads of doomed possibilities interwoven with cries of despair. Veil Mythos loomed over it all, a presence both monstrous and inevitable. John felt the pull of that dark name, its resonance a chilling reminder of the power they faced. With a firm grip, John shook Eldridge's shoulder, forcing him to focus. The contact broke through the spiral of terror, grounding the scholar in the fragile present. "Listen to me, Eldridge," John insisted, his voice cutting through the din with surgical precision. "This isn't the end. Not yet." Eldridge blinked rapidly, as if waking from a nightmare that refused to let go. The loop of visions loosened its hold, and for a moment clarity returned. He sagged against John's presence, his body trembling with exhaustion and revelation. I thought I was alone," he admitted, the admission both a confession and a plea. "You were never alone," John replied, his tone firm yet laced with understanding. "Now let's get out of here before it collapses." Together they turned away from the maddening swirl, their steps gaining strength as they moved toward a future still unwritten. But the specter of Veil Mythos lingered in their wake, a chilling echo of what lay ahead. Papers swirled like wounded birds around John and Eldridge, a storm of fractured thought and disarray. The warped floor tilted beneath them, distorting lines and reason. They knelt amid the littered ruins, speaking in tones of hushed determination, voices edged with desperation. Arcane symbols, broken in bleeding ink, lay scattered like accusations at their feet. They worked in unison, a choreography of frenzied grace, their hands dancing over scorched manuscripts and charred artifacts. Each syllable of the incantation fell like a stone into dark water, rippling with unstable energy, binding the tumult to their will. In the heart of the storm they were methodical, movements precise despite the chaos that threatened to engulf them. They arranged relics and fragments with practiced efficiency, their minds honed to a single purpose. John's eyes shone with that uncanny light, cutting through the haze, focusing on the arcane configurations they hastily assembled. Eldridge moved with equal urgency, his academic composure fraying at the edges but holding firm. The environment seemed to conspire against them, an unstable maze of shifting angles and twisted space, yet they persisted, driven by the necessity to act, to contain the nightmare that loomed over reality itself. "We need to stabilize it," John said, his voice a calm anchor amid the turmoil. His fingers traced the edges of a scorched manuscript, aligning it with precision. "These must be placed before we start." Eldridge nodded, his face a mask of intense concentration. He grabbed a charred artifact, its surface etched with dark, indecipherable markings. "The energy conduits," he replied, almost to himself. "We have to use the artifacts as conduits." He placed it carefully, each action carrying the weight of consequence. Their plan unfolded in terse, urgent exchanges, a language of shared desperation. Every item, every word was part of a precarious balance, a gamble against overwhelming odds. The stakes were painfully clear. Failure meant not just death, but the unraveling of everything they knew. The presence of Veil Mythos hung over them, a shadow of dark inevitability, but they worked with the resolve of those who have nothing left to lose, binding themselves to the fragile hope that they could succeed. The incantations began as whispers, woven into the fabric of their movements. They grew louder, more insistent, shaping the chaos around them into a semblance of order. John and Eldridge's voices resonated into low, rhythmic chants, the words vibrating with arcane power. They repeated the phrases with a desperate harmony, their bodies moving in sync with the syllables. The unstable forces trembled at their touch, both dangerous and malleable. They were binding demons to chains of language, shackling uncertainty with spoken will. The space responded to their ritual, convulsing with the strain of containment. The ground shook beneath them, each tremor a reminder of the power they sought to control. John's face was a study of grim determination, his jaw set against the odds. Eldridge showed the strain more visibly, sweat beading on his forehead, but his resolve remained unbroken. Together they pushed against the tide, their actions a defiance of cosmic proportions. "Hold it steady," John called out, his voice barely audible above the tumult. His hands moved with deliberate speed, shifting a critical piece into place. The fractured reality seemed to fight back, lashing out with violent bursts of energy. Eldridge clenched his teeth, adjusting a symbol that had begun to slip. "We can do this," he said, his voice filled with conviction that bordered on madness. The air around them crackled with a raw potential, threatening to ignite. But they continued, defying the limitations of both body and mind, pushing the ritual to its breaking point. The environment heaved with resistance, but the binds began to take hold, the unthinkable forces bending to their will. The chaos that had enveloped them now centered, drawn into the focal point of their design. John and Eldridge moved faster, their actions blurring into a single desperate effort. It was an act of sheer will, a fight against the collapse of everything. In those final moments, the space contracted violently, a beast struggling against its chains. The very air seemed to scream with the pressure of containment, but the pattern held. John's eyes met Eldridge's, a shared look of defiant hope as the last syllables fell. The ritual took root, a seed of stability in the field of chaos, leaving them breathless and alive with possibility. The ritual neared its zenith and the space convulsed with apocalyptic fury. Reality folded upon itself, collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane, pulling multiple timelines into a monstrous nexus. John and Eldridge stood at the eye of the storm, besieged by its terrible beauty, and the anomaly writhed as if alive. Eldridge's eyes met John's in a moment of raw understanding, a choice made without words. He turned toward the chaos, his resolve written in every line of his face, and let it consume him. A final gesture of sacrifice, redirecting the raging energy into itself. John was hurled away by the explosion, thrown through the dying portal and into the cold, dim halls of Arkham. His body lay battered, his mind shadowed by what he had witnessed, but the echo of Eldridge's choice lingered, a spectral reminder that their battle with Vale Mythos was not yet over. He lay there, the cold silence of the old building enveloping him, stark against the memory of tumult and light. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, indifferent to the violence that had just transpired. John's vision wavered, the afterimage of the Nexus burned into his eyes, a haunting residue of intersecting worlds. The corridors stretched out in eerie quiet, the everyday gloom a stark contrast to the catastrophic beauty he'd left behind. John pulled himself up, his body protesting each movement with the sharp reminders of the physical toll, but the deeper wounds lay elsewhere, embedded in thought and conscience. Eldridge's choice replayed in his mind, an endless loop of self-sacrifice that he struggled to accept. John's eyes flickered with that strange light, now subdued, casting fractured shadows that seemed to echo the unresolved tension within him. "What have you done?" he whispered to the empty hall, the question as much for himself as for the absent scholar. He felt the weight of Eldridge's final act, a burden both mournful and profound. John's steps were unsteady as he moved through the familiar but now alien space of Arkham. Each footfall was an attempt to ground himself in this reality, to make sense of the one he had left behind. The influence of Vale Mythos lingered like a dark promise, the entity's reach extending beyond the scholar's sacrifice. John knew the battle was far from over, that the entity's shadow stretched across more than just one world. But the echo of Eldridge's choice resonated deeply, a reminder of the resolve that had not died with him. John paused, listening to the silence that enveloped him. It was vast and hollow, a haunting void that refused to answer the questions it raised. But within that silence was the ghost of Eldridge's defiance, a whispered vow that even veiled Mythos could not entirely smother. John squared his shoulders, determination hardening through the ache of loss. Their struggle continued, a battle played out across timelines and fates, but it was not one that he would face alone. The shadows stretched long as he walked, his resolve casting them into shapes of strange, resilient hope. The shadows gathered thick and expectant around the dim room where John sat alone. His presence was the only thing breathing life into the airless void, yet he moved with the grace of a specter. At his ancient oak desk he unfolded a brittle, handwritten note, holding the fragile paper with fingers that trembled and betrayed a sorrow deeply suppressed. All around him the relics of past investigations lay as if in mourning. The faded photographs, the creased maps, the cracked spine of a familiar tome, each whispering their own lament. But John's eyes fixed on one image in particular, a small framed portrait of Dr. Samuel Eldridge. As he gazed upon it, his intense eyes narrowed, and the room seemed to lean in with bated breath. A candle flickered erratically on the desk, casting an eldritch glow that gave life to the elongated shadows dancing on the cracked, time-worn wallpaper. The note crinkled softly as he opened it further, the paper's brittleness threatening to shatter like old bones. Each letter scrawled by Dr. Eldridge's hand seemed to pulse with the weight of unspeakable knowledge. John's eyes moved across the page, but it was as though he read not with sight alone. He felt the familiar burden settle deeper into his soul, pressing down with the force of his suppressed grief. Though the room was silent, the echoes of past voices lingered like unwelcome guests, filling the empty space with their silent accusations. His fingers trembled again, a subtle admission of his tormented state. His gaze returned to the portrait of Eldridge. The face of his old companion stared back at him with an unsettling mixture of wisdom and accusation, as though aware of the perilous journey they had once undertaken. John's mind waded through the murky waters of memory, dredging up the image of Dr. Eldridge's fervent dedication and the steep cost of his pursuits. The flame of the candle threw shadows that seemed to writhe in time with his thoughts, painting an ominous mural of what had been lost. Recent sacrifices gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, refusing to fade into the background. John's hands moved with a mechanical precision, arranging documents and mementos on the desk. The dim room closed in on him, each corner thick with the substance of regret. It was a prison he had built from the fragments of his own past, where every breath was tainted by the knowledge of what he could not reclaim. John's eyes lingered on a frayed and ancient map pinned to the wall, its ink lines bleeding into the yellowed paper like the remnants of a faded memory. The map's unsteady contours spoke of journeys both literal and figurative, their paths converging on a single, haunting point that mirrored the emptiness of his heart. His attention returned to the note. Dr. Eldridge's final words seemed to crawl across the page, each sentence a twisted thread in the fabric of their shared fate. The weight of the paper grew unbearable, and he placed it atop the pile of assembled memories where it lay like an epitaph for what was yet to come. Despite the encroaching darkness, John's movements remained steady, each deliberate action a testament to his resolve. He stood slowly, the room groaning under the strain of his solitary existence. The flickering candle continued its erratic dance, casting grotesque shadows that elongated and distorted with each passing second. Yet within the tumult there was a rhythm, a slow, steady pulse that mirrored John's unyielding heart. The sense of oppression grew, yet John remained unmoved by fear. Instead, he was driven by an inexorable pull toward the truth, no matter the cost. He reached for a familiar coat draped over the back of a weathered chair, its fabric as worn and resolute as he. The haunting atmosphere closed around him like a lover's embrace, promising both comfort and torment. But John was ready. The candle wavered, a final gesture of defiance against the looming dark, and then fell still. His eyes reflected the eldritch light, an unholy glow that spoke of past sins and future trials. Alone in the suffocating silence, John embraced the solitude with open arms, his determination unbroken by the haunting reminders of all he had lost. And as the oppressive quiet deepened, he knew with unwavering certainty that he would not be alone for long. The quiet expanded like a living thing, filling the room with an oppressive hush that wrapped itself around John's thoughts. Then came the laughter, a soft and mocking echo that ricocheted off the bare walls and sliced through the silence with surgical precision.